There is one detail about the 1966 Le Mans race that Ford Motor Company has never once put in a press release, never celebrated at an anniversary event, and never brought up in the 50 years of marketing built around that victory. Ken Miles was on pace to lap every single car on that circuit except his own Ford teammates. His dominance was so complete, so total, so embarrassing to every other team on the grid that Ford management genuinely discussed whether winning too convincingly might damage their relationships with other manufacturers. So they slowed him down, and then they took his victory away entirely. Hi, my name is Johnny, and this is American Muscle, the deal that was never about racing. And the beginning of this story has almost nothing to do with racing. 1963, Ford Motor Company is bleeding image. The post-war generation that bought their father's sedans is growing up, and they want something European, something sexy, something that doesn't look like a refrigerator on wheels. Henry Ford II, grandson of the founder, and a man who took corporate slights approximately as well as a cornered badger, decides the solution is to buy Ferrari. Not partner with Ferrari, not sponsor Ferrari, buy it, absorb it. Put a Ford badge on the most prestigious racing operation in the world and let the glamour transfer over like a coat of paint. The negotiations got further than most people realize. Ford sent a team to Maranello. Enzo Ferrari was genuinely interested. He doodled combined logos. His lawyer Franco Gozzi was in the room. The deal was real, and it was close. And then Enzo read the fine print. Ford wanted control of the racing division. And Enzo Ferrari, a man who had built his entire identity around the belief that racing was the reason the road cars existed, and not the other way around, looked at that clause and detonated. His lawyer Gozzi later described a tirade he had never witnessed before in his entire professional life. Enzo called Ford executives worthless sons of who made big ugly cars for a pig-headed boss, and that's the cleaned-up version. Henry Ford II's response, according to people who were in the room, was not the thunderous profanity the film implies. It was quiet, controlled, surgical. He said, "All right, we'll beat his ass. We're gonna race him." Now, here's what the film completely glosses over. Ford's motivation for racing Le Mans was never primarily about proving American engineering could beat Italian engineering. It was about humiliating one specific Italian man in the most public arena available. This was a corporate vendetta dressed up as a motorsport program. And understanding that changes everything about what follows, because it explains why Ford was willing to spend what some estimates put at $100 million chasing a trophy that, by any rational business calculation, made absolutely no sense to pursue. $100 million in 1963 money to win a race in France, to embarrass a 70-year-old man in Maranello who had once insulted Henry Ford II's executives. That's not a racing program. That's a grudge with a budget. Shelby wasn't the underdog Hollywood sold. Ford versus Ferrari needs you to believe that Carroll Shelby was a wild card, a charming outsider Ford discovered and handed a blank check to, a riverboat gambler brought in to shake up the establishment. It's a great story. It is almost entirely backwards. By the time Ford called Shelby in 1963, he had already beaten Ferrari, not symbolically, literally. His Cobra Daytona coupe had finished fourth at Le Mans in 1964 behind 3 Ferraris and came within a mechanical failure of winning outright. That same car went on to become the only American vehicle ever to win the International GT Championship against Ferrari on European tracks with a Ford engine. Shelby had been working with Ford since 1962. The Powered by Ford badge was already on his Cobra Roadsters. They were already destroying Corvettes at American circuits. The relationship between Shelby and Ford wasn't a gamble. It was a continuation of a program that was already working. The film shows Iacocca approaching Shelby with a blank check. The reality is that Shelby showed up at Ford's Detroit headquarters with a rehearsed pitch asking for $25,000 to build 2 cars. He was the one selling. He was the one who needed the deal, because Shelby, for all his genius, was always about 30 days from being broke. That tension, the constant financial tightrope, was real. The scrappy outsider mythology layered on top of it was not. And here's the thing, Hollywood never tells you about underdogs. The most dangerous competitor you can face isn't someone with nothing to lose. It's someone who has already beaten you once, knows exactly how they did it, and has spent the intervening years quietly fixing everything that went wrong. That was Shelby in 1965. Not a gamble, a loaded gun. The man they compressed into a caricature. Christian Bale's performance as Ken Miles is extraordinary. I want to be clear about that up front, because what I'm about to say isn't a criticism of the acting. It's a criticism of what the script did to the man underneath it. The film gives you an explosive, confrontational, magnificent eccentric. A man who threatens officials with wrenches, punches his best friend in the face as a greeting, and burns with barely contained fury at every turn. He's spectacular on screen. He is also a fairly significant departure from the man who actually existed. People who knew Ken Miles describe him differently. They use words like courteous, precise, sardonic. He was sometimes called the Sterling Moss of the West Coast, which in 1960s racing circles was about the highest compliment available. He was known as a clean competitor, a man with such exceptional sensitivity to a car's limits that he rarely made contact with other drivers, even in the most aggressive racing situations. He was a teacher. Shelby himself said Miles would take time to teach the other drivers. He reminded me of Fangio in that regard. And Miles himself? Here's how he described driving: a hobby, a relaxation for me, like golfing is to others. A hobby, like golfing. That is not the description of a man eating the upholstery off the inside of his own race car with barely restrained competitive rage. What the film also skips is the war. Not just that he served, which it does show, but what the service actually made him. Miles didn't just drive tanks into Normandy. On October 1st, 1942, he became one of the founding members of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, an elite corps responsible for keeping armored vehicles functional under combat conditions. He ended the war as a staff sergeant and tank commander, responsible for the mechanical integrity of machines where failure meant death. Think about what that actually produces in a man. Years of diagnosing problems at speed, years of making split-second decisions about metal under stress, years of understanding exactly where the edge of a machine's tolerance is, and what happens when you exceed it. When Ken Miles told Ford their GT40 was dangerous, he wasn't complaining. He was giving them a battlefield assessment from a man who had spent years keeping armored vehicles together in conditions that would destroy lesser machines and lesser men. The film gives you the eccentricity and leaves out the bedrock. It gives you the wrenches and skips the war, and in doing so, it accidentally makes him smaller than he was. The race Ford erased from its own history. Here is something Ford versus Ferrari simply pretends did not happen. In 1964, a full year before the failed race the film treats as Ford's debut disaster, Ford went to Le Mans and failed even more spectacularly. All three GT40s entered in 1964 retired. The car was fundamentally flawed. The aerodynamics were wrong, the gearbox was fragile, and the cockpit temperatures were so extreme that drivers were being cooked alive at race speeds. One driver described the inside of the car as a furnace on wheels, which, I'll be honest, sounds like something you'd see on a Yelp review for the worst hotel in the world, but in a racing context is significantly more dangerous. The film skips this entirely. It jumps straight from the acquisition of Shelby's team to the 1965 failure, treating that as Ford's first attempt. It wasn't. It was their second. And understanding that changes the entire scope of what Shelby and Miles were actually doing. They weren't fixing a car that had failed once. They were fixing a car that had failed twice in 2 consecutive years. In the most demanding endurance race on the planet, the engineering challenge wasn't incremental improvement. It was a complete reinvention of a machine that had demonstrated, repeatedly, that it could not survive 24 hours at Le Mans. And here is the detail that makes Ford's eventual victory even more remarkable than the film suggests. Ford wasn't just throwing money at the problem, though they were absolutely throwing money at the problem. They were using 1960s technology in ways that had never been applied to motorsport before. Engine dynamometers that could simulate the exact stresses of Le Mans and run engines until they literally exploded. Primitive computer programs to calibrate suspension geometry. Back-to-back simulation runs that destroyed dozens of engines before they ever reached France. This was not a scrappy underdog operation. This was a corporation deploying every technological advantage available with unlimited resources and a personal mandate from the grandson of Henry Ford himself. Hiding the 1964 failure makes the victory look like inspiration. Showing it would reveal something more accurate and more impressive. That it was also the product of relentless, unglamorous, expensive engineering work that most audiences would find considerably less cinematic than Matt Damon staring into the middle distance. The internal war nobody talks about. The film positions Ferrari as Ford's great enemy at Le Mans 1966. Here is the uncomfortable truth. By midnight on race day, Ferrari's lead car was running in 12th place. Ferrari was not Ford's competition. Ford was. The man who actually led the 1966 Le Mans race for most of its duration wasn't Ken Miles. It was Dan Gurney, the American racing legend who appears in Ford versus Ferrari for approximately the same amount of screen time as the catering truck. Gurney set the pace, built the lead, and drove what multiple people in the paddock considered the race of his life. Then his engine blew 6 hours from the finish. Ford had entered multiple cars, which meant multiple drivers, which meant multiple egos, which meant the real tactical problem was never how to beat Ferrari. It was how to manage the fact that Ford's own drivers were racing each other harder than they were racing anyone else. At Sebring earlier that year, Miles and Gurney were fighting each other so aggressively that Shelby had to signal them from the pit wall to back off. On the final lap, Gurney's car broke down entirely. He got out and started pushing it toward the finish line and was disqualified for the effort. The film skips Sebring almost entirely, which is a shame because it contains something that tells you everything about the internal dynamics of this program. These were not teammates executing a coordinated strategy. They were competitors who happened to be driving for the same company, held in uneasy formation by Shelby's authority and the constant threat of mechanical failure. And then came the decision that would define the whole program's legacy. Not Leo Beebe's decision, not Henry Ford II's decision. One conversation between two men in a pit lane who both thought they were doing the right thing. The photo finish lie. Ford versus Ferrari gives you a villain. His name is Leo Beebe. He wears a suit, and he represents everything soulless and corporate about the machine that grinds down brilliant individuals. It's a clean narrative. It is also wrong in the specific way that matters most. Here is what actually happened. With 3 Ford GT40s running first, second, and third, Beebe approached Shelby and asked him a question. Who do you think should win the race? Shelby's answer wasn't protest. It wasn't defiance. It was a question back. What do you think ought to happen, Leo? And Beebe said he'd kind of like to see all 3 of them cross the finish line together. And Shelby said, let's do it that way then. That's it. That's the whole conversation. No villain. No conspiracy. 2 men who both thought they were doing something generous and memorable, neither of whom knew that French race officials would interpret the tie finish rules in a way that handed the victory to Bruce McLaren based on starting position. Shelby spent the rest of his life with that. 46 years from that pit lane conversation to his death in 2012. He said it plainly in his later years. In 1966, Ford didn't cost Ken Miles the race at Le Mans. I did, and I regret it to this day. And Miles himself. A Shelby mechanic named John Collins was there. After Shelby told Miles to hold his position for the photo finish, Collins heard Miles say in a loud voice, "So ends my contribution to this bloody motor race." And he threw his sunglasses across the pit. That's the real Ken Miles, not stoic, not philosophical, furious and professional in the same breath. Containing the anger because that was who he was. Complying with the order while making absolutely clear what it was costing him. And what it was costing him was not just a race victory. Miles had already won Daytona that year. He had already won Sebring. Had he won Le Mans, he would have become the first driver in history to win the 24 hours of Daytona, the 12 hours of Sebring, and the 24 hours of Le Mans in the same calendar year. As of today, in 2026, 60 years later, that feat has never been achieved. Not by Andretti, not by Alonso, not by any driver who has ever sat in a racing car. The Triple Crown of endurance racing in a single season remains the most elusive individual achievement in motorsport history. And the only man who ever had all 3 within his grasp simultaneously threw his sunglasses across a pit lane in France and drove a controlled dead heat instead. How Ken Miles died, and what his death built. 2 months after Le Mans, August 17, 1966, Riverside International Raceway, California. The film shows Miles dying in a fire. It's a dramatic death. It's also not quite what happened, and the real circumstances are both more mundane and more haunting. Miles was testing the Ford J car, a prototype intended to succeed the GT40. It had a distinctive breadloaf-shaped rear section, an experiment in what engineers called camback aerodynamic theory. The honeycomb panel construction was supposed to make it both lighter and stiffer. It looked radical and strange and forward-thinking. It was also, at race speeds, acting like an aircraft wing. Here is what Ford versus Ferrari does not tell you. The J car had already killed someone before Ken Miles ever climbed into it. Walt Hansgen, a four-time SCCA road racing champion, a Formula One point scorer, and one of the most respected American drivers of his generation, died testing a Ford GT40 at Le Mans in April 1966. After Hansgen's death, Ford shelved the J car program. The dangerous prototype sat in a garage for months while engineers tried to understand what had gone wrong. 4 months later, they resumed testing with Miles at the wheel. A series of trouble-free laps had been completed before the accident. On the final run, there was nothing to indicate anything wrong as the car came down the back straight at approximately 175 miles per hour. Then it went out of control, spun to the inside, went over an embankment, bounced end over end. Miles was ejected and was dead of head injuries before emergency crews reached him. The fire that consumed the wreckage destroyed most of the evidence. The cause was never officially determined. But in the decades since, the physics have become clear. At high speed, the J car's camback rear section was generating lift. The breadloaf shape that Ford's engineers were excited about was, under the right conditions, trying to make the car fly. At over 200 miles per hour on a downhill straight in hot California desert air, the rear of that car won its argument with the road. Miles' son Peter was 15 years old. He was at Riverside that day with his mother. He watched his father die. He has not been back to Le Mans since. And here is the detail that makes this story something other than pure tragedy. Ford, under pressure after the second fatal testing accident in 5 months, mandated that all future versions of the car be fitted with a roll cage similar to those used in NASCAR Grand National Competition. That roll cage became standard. It was fitted to the Ford Mark IV that replaced the J car, and at Le Mans in 1967, Mario Andretti had a massive accident in that car and walked away. The roll cage that saved Mario Andretti's life exists because Ken Miles died without one. Steel roll cages became standardized in sports car racing following Miles's accident. The safety infrastructure that has protected drivers for the past 60 years carries his name nowhere on it, credits him in no document, and was built entirely on the lessons of his death. He made it possible from beyond the grave, the man who spent years keeping armored vehicles together under battlefield conditions, who built the car that beat Ferrari, who drove the greatest unrecognized performance in Le Mans history, left his final contribution to the sport, not in a victory lane or a record book, but in the structural specifications of every racing car that came after him. Ford versus Ferrari is a great film. I want to be clear about that too, the same way I was clear about Bale's performance. It gets the emotional truth right. The racing sequences are real, the brake rotor strategy was real, the photo finish happened, and the grief was genuine. Shelby really did carry that pit lane conversation with him for the rest of his life. But the real story is messier, and bigger, and more devastating than 2.5 hours could ever contain. It's the story of a man whose most extraordinary achievement was erased by a casual conversation between two people who meant well, whose death built safety standards that saved lives he never knew, whose name took 35 years to reach a Hall of Fame and a Hollywood film to reach the rest of us. Ken Miles didn't die a hero's death. He died a working man's death on a Tuesday afternoon in the California desert, testing a prototype for a company that had just taken the greatest moment of his career away from him. He deserved better from history, and honestly, he deserved better from the film too. I'm Johnny. This is American Muscle. If you want the stories that didn't make the cut, the history that got left on the editing room floor, hit subscribe. New episodes every week. I'll see you in the next one.